By 8 o'clock Saturday morning, the county fairground had already begun to shake. Diesel engines rumbled behind the livestock barns. Vendors unfolded canvas awnings along the gravel lanes. Children pressed their faces against temporary fences while farmers gathered near the demonstration field, coffee cups steaming in their hands. At the center of the field stood the machine everyone had come to see. It was nearly 12 feet tall at the cab, painted a deep metallic green, with tires taller than most of the men surrounding it. LED work lights lined the roof. Cameras were mounted near the hood and rear hitch. Inside the sealed cabin, 3 glowing screens displayed maps, engine data, wheel slip, fuel use, and automatic guidance controls. A polished sign beside it read, Advanced Agricultural Demonstration Unit. Estimated configuration value, $510. Ling ling ling. Bradley Cole stood beneath the sign as though the tractor belonged to him personally. Technically, it belonged to the dealership sponsoring the county's annual pulling exhibition. Bradley was only the regional sales director, but his spotless boots, embroidered jacket, and constant smile made it clear that he considered himself the most important piece of equipment on the field. This machine doesn't guess, he told a group of farmers. It measures. It adjusts power automatically. It corrects wheel slip before the operator even feels it. Several men nodded approvingly. They had spent their lives fighting heavy soil, broken equipment, and narrow planting windows. To them, a tractor that could think faster than a tired operator was not merely impressive. It was insurance against losing an entire season. Bradley placed one hand on the enormous rear tire. $510,000 sounds like a lot, he continued, until you calculate what outdated equipment costs you in downtime. That was when the old pickup entered the fairground. It came through the gate slowly, pulling a low steel trailer that leaned slightly to the left. A faded red flag had been tied to the rear corner. Chains rattled against the trailer bed each time the truck crossed a rut. At first, no one paid much attention. Then they saw what was chained to the trailer. The machine looked less like a tractor than something excavated from an abandoned factory. Its paint had long ago faded into patches of brown, black, and dull gray. The exposed engine was covered by a rounded steel hood scarred with dents. There was no cabin, no padded seat, and no rubber tires. Instead, 2 enormous iron wheels stood at the rear, each lined with thick steel lugs. A narrow metal seat rested above the axle. The steering wheel was thin and cracked. A flywheel sat exposed along the side of the engine, and a long hand crank had been strapped beside the footboard. Someone near the fence laughed. "What year is that thing?" Another man answered. "Before roads." The laughter spread quickly. Henry Dalton heard every word as he stepped from the pickup. He was 63, broad across the shoulders, with a sun-darkened face and hands marked by old cuts. His denim jacket had been repaired at one elbow, and dried clay clung to the sides of his boots. He did not look toward the crowd. He walked to the trailer, checked the chains, and ran one hand across the tractor's rear wheel. The machine had been built in 1920. It had belonged to his grandfather, Samuel Dalton, who had used it to pull logs, power a threshing machine, break new ground, and drag loaded wagons through fields where horses sank to their knees. To everyone else, it was a relic. To Henry, it was the last working thing on the farm that still carried his grandfather's touch. Bradley approached with 2 dealership employees following behind him. His smile widened when he saw the iron wheels. "Well," he said, loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear, "I was told we had a historical display this year. I didn't realize it would be entering under its own power." More laughter. Henry loosened a chain. "It isn't here for display." Bradley glanced at the registration number painted on the trailer's side. "You entered it in the pull?" Henry nodded. For a moment, Bradley appeared genuinely confused. Then he turned toward the crowd, as if Henry had just delivered the perfect line for a comedy routine. "The open class pull? That's what the form said." Bradley looked again at the old tractor. The luxury machine behind him produced several hundred horsepower. Henry's tractor had no digital controls, no hydraulic traction system, and no enclosed transmission. By modern standards, its engine was weak, slow, and inefficient. "You understand what we're pulling today?" Bradley asked. "A weighted sled?" "A progressive weighted sled," Bradley corrected. "The farther it moves, the heavier the drag becomes." Henry removed another chain. "I know how a sled works." Bradley's smile hardened slightly. "We're not pulling an empty hay wagon across your grandfather's pasture." Henry finally looked at him. "No," he said. "Your field is wetter?" Bradley glanced toward the demonstration track. The surface had been graded that morning. From a distance it looked firm, but rain earlier in the week had left darker patches near the far end. "The field has been inspected," Bradley said. Henry stepped down from the trailer and pressed the heel of his boot into the soil. The crust broke beneath his weight. Under it was a thin layer of damp clay. He rubbed the soil between his fingers. Behind him, the crowd continued laughing at the old machine. Bradley saw rust. The spectators saw obsolescence. Henry saw the steel lugs on the rear wheels, the low gearing beneath the transmission case, and the heavy flywheel designed to keep turning when an engine reached the edge of its strength. Then he looked across the track toward the soft ground, waiting beneath the dry surface. "Good," Henry said quietly. "Then let's see what the inspection missed." Henry had been 9 years old, the first time he saw the tractor pull something that should not have moved. It was late autumn, long before the farm had electricity in every building, and before the county road was paved. Rain had fallen for 3 days, turning the lower pasture into black mud. A timber truck carrying 2 oak logs had slipped off the old access road and settled against the ditch. The rear axle was buried nearly to its hub. 2 men from town came with shovels. Another brought a newer tractor with rubber tires. They dug around the wheels, laid boards under the truck, and wrapped chains around the frame. Each attempt ended the same way. The tractor spun. Mit flew. The truck did not move. Henry stood beneath the barn roof, watching the adults become louder and less patient. His grandfather Samuel said very little. He walked across the yard, stopped beside the buried truck, and studied the ground. He looked at the slope, the direction of the ruts, and the dark line where water had gathered beneath the grass. Then he returned to the machine shed and opened the doors. The old tractor was already more than 20 years old. Its paint was faded even then. The iron wheels were scarred from fieldwork, and the steering wheel had been wrapped with cloth where the surface had cracked. One of the men laughed when Samuel drove it toward the ditch. "That antique won't do what the new one couldn't." Samuel did not answer. He positioned the tractor at an angle instead of pulling directly from the road. He chose a patch of firmer ground near a line of cedar roots. Then he attached the chain low beneath the rear axle. Henry noticed that his grandfather did not place the hook where it was easiest to reach. He crawled through the mud and fastened it close to the center of the tractor. "Why there?" Henry asked. Samuel wiped his hands on his trousers. "Because a chain can pull more than a load," he said. "It can pull weight off your own wheels if you give it the wrong angle." Henry did not fully understand. Samuel climbed onto the metal seat and placed the tractor in its lowest gear. The engine fired in slow, heavy beats. The iron wheels turned. At first, nothing happened. The chain tightened until every link stood straight. The tractor's front end lifted only slightly, then settled. Samuel did not increase the throttle. He let the engine work. The rear lugs pressed into the firm layer beneath the mud. The flywheel turned steadily, inch by inch. The truck's rear axle rose from the ditch. The men stopped talking. The truck moved perhaps 6 feet before the chain slackened. Samuel backed up, repositioned, and pulled again. After the third attempt, the truck stood on the road. That evening, Henry followed his grandfather into the machine shed. The tractor sat beneath a hanging lantern, wet with mud. Samuel cleaned the wheels with a flat iron scraper and checked the chain for stretched links. Henry asked the question that had stayed with him all afternoon. Was it stronger than the other tractor? Samuel shook his head. No. Then why did it pull the truck? Samuel pointed toward the rear wheel. Strength is not the same as useful force. He tapped one of the steel lugs with the scraper. The other machine had more engine, but its tires were turning on top of the mud. These reached through it. Then he pointed toward the low hitch. And I kept the pull where the weight could help us, instead of fighting us. Henry looked at the tractor differently after that. Before, it had been noisy and slow, a machine that required oil, tools, and patience. Afterward, it became a collection of decisions. The large flywheel was not oversized by accident. It stored energy between each firing stroke. The low gear was not a sign of weakness. It exchanged speed for force at the wheels. The iron lugs were not crude substitutes for tires. They were designed for loose ground where smooth rubber could lose contact. Samuel taught Henry to listen to the engine without staring at the controls. A sharp exhaust note meant the load was changing too quickly. A slowing flywheel meant the engine was approaching the point where one more demand could stop it. A front axle rising too high meant the pull had shifted too much weight backward. You don't conquer the ground, Samuel often told him. You learn what it will allow. Over the years, Henry saw the tractor perform jobs that no machine dealer would have recommended. It powered a saw through a long flat belt. It pulled a thresher between farms. It dragged storm-fallen trees from the creek bottom. It hauled wagons of stone for the foundation of a new dairy barn. The tractor never moved quickly. Samuel never asked it to. When Henry was 17, he once complained that the machine took too long to cross a field. His grandfather stopped beside him. A fast machine is useful when the job rewards speed. Samuel said, a slow machine is useful when stopping is the danger. At the time, Henry thought it was only advice about tractors. Years later, he understood that Samuel had been speaking about nearly everything. The farm passed from Samuel to Henry's father, then eventually to Henry. New machines arrived. The old tractor was pushed deeper into the shed. After Samuel died, Henry's father wanted to sell it. A scrap dealer offered money by weight. Nothing on it is useful anymore, his father said. Henry stood beside the iron wheel and remembered the timber truck rising from the ditch. He bought the tractor himself for the same amount the scrap dealer had offered. For years, it did not run. Mice nested beneath the hood. The fuel tank collected rust. One cylinder seized. The magneto failed. Henry repaired it slowly. He found replacement parts at farm auctions, machined bushings in a friend's workshop, and rebuilt the fuel system from diagrams printed before he was born. He never restored it until it looked new. The dents remained. The worn metal remained. So did the shallow groove on the steering wheel, where Samuel's left hand had rested for decades. Now, at the county fair, Henry stood beside that same wheel while strangers photographed the tractor and laughed at its age. Across the field, the luxury tractor idled beneath a polished banner. Bradley Cole was explaining horsepower to the crowd. Henry placed his hand on the old steering wheel. He could almost hear Samuel's voice. The question was never which machine had more power. The question was whether the ground would let that power matter. By 10 o'clock, the crowd around the demonstration field had doubled. Farmers arrived in work, trucks still dusted with gravel. Families came from the midway, carrying paper cups of lemonade. Teenagers climbed onto the lower rails of the fence to get a better view. At the center of it all, Bradley Cole stood beside the luxury tractor, with a wireless microphone in one hand. The machine idled behind him with a low, controlled hum. Unlike Henry's tractor, it did not shake. It did not cough smoke or reveal its moving parts. The engine remained hidden beneath smooth body panels, and the cabin glass reflected the bright county banners hanging over the field. Bradley waited until the crowd quieted. What you're looking at, he began, is not simply a tractor. He paused, letting the statement settle. It is a complete field management platform. One of the dealership employees activated the exterior display screen. A digital map of the demonstration track appeared, divided into colored sections. Bradley pointed toward it. This system monitors engine load, ground speed, wheel slip, hydraulic demand, fuel consumption, and implement performance in real time. The screen changed. A diagram showed power moving from the engine through the transmission to all four wheels. When conditions change, Bradley continued, the tractor changes with them. It can adjust transmission response, redistribute power, and reduce unnecessary wheel spin before most operators even realize traction is being lost. The crowd reacted with quiet approval. These were not people easily impressed by polished speeches. Most had repaired machines in freezing barns or worked through planting seasons when every hour mattered. They knew what downtime cost. Bradley knew it too. That was why he did not sell the tractor as a luxury. He sold it as protection. Think about a narrow planting window. He said, you have 2 good days before rain. A machine goes down, and suddenly you are not losing hours. You are losing yield. Several farmers nodded. Or imagine pulling a wide tillage tool through variable soil. An older machine forces the operator to react after the problem starts. This tractor reads the change first. His eyes moved briefly toward Henry's machine. The old tractor stood near the edge of the field, still strapped to the trailer. It looked smaller in full daylight. Its iron wheels were narrow compared with the modern tractor's enormous dual tires. The metal seat appeared almost fragile. A dark stain marked the bottom of the engine housing where oil had seeped through an old gasket. Bradley smiled. Of course, he said. Some people prefer a more traditional approach. The crowd turned. Henry was kneeling beside the trailer, loosening the last chain. A few people laughed before Bradley had to say anything else. He walked toward Henry with the microphone still live. Mr. Dalton, he called. Would you mind telling everyone exactly what you brought us? Henry stood slowly. A tractor. The answer drew another laugh. Bradley stopped beside the trailer. Yes. I think we established that. What year? 1920. Bradley looked back toward the crowd. A few whistles rose from near the fence. 1920. Bradley repeated. So this machine was built before commercial radio became common in American homes. Henry pulled the loading ramp into place. It was built to work. That is exactly what we intend to test. Bradley gestured toward the weighted sled at the far end of the track. It was a long steel platform with a broad skid at the front. A heavy weight box sat on rails above it. As the sled moved forward, gears would pull the box toward the front, increasing downward pressure on the skid. The farther a tractor pulled, the harder the sled resisted. This is not a race, Bradley explained to the crowd. It is a progressive load pull. Every foot makes the job more difficult. He turned back to Henry. Your registration says open class? That's right. Open class includes modern high-horsepower machines. I read the form. Bradley lowered the microphone slightly. For the first time, his voice lost some of its performance. You know what happens if a driveline part breaks under load? Yes. Or if one of those iron wheels loses grip? Yes. This is not a gentle exhibition. Henry looked past him toward the track. A tractor from the grounds crew had already made several passes over the surface. The top layer appeared dry and compacted, but the tire marks near the far end were darker than the rest. The ground will decide how gentle it is, Henry said. Bradley raised the microphone again. There you have it. The crowd laughed, but Bradley did not. He studied Henry for another second. Bradley had met men like him at farm auctions and dealership counters. Men who distrusted electronics because they could not repair them with a wrench. Men who remembered every machine they had owned and measured reliability by how little technology it contained. He believed Henry was one of them. That made the demonstration useful. A clean victory over the antique would give the crowd a simple image, the past beside the future. With no argument left about which one belonged in the field, Bradley stepped closer to the iron wheel. How much horsepower does it make? Enough for its work. That was not the question. Henry wiped his hands on a rag. depending on how it is measured. Not much. Bradley nodded toward the luxury tractor. That machine produces several times more power before it reaches half load. Henry glanced at it. It should. The answer was so calm that Bradley frowned. You do understand you cannot win a pull with sentiment. No. Good. You cannot win one with a price tag either. The laughter stopped for a moment. Bradley's smile returned. But now it was tighter. He raised the microphone. Then perhaps we should make this interesting. The event judge, Carl Mercer, looked up from the registration table. Bradley pointed toward the track. Run the standard exhibition pull first. Then let Mr. Dalton enter under the same sled settings. Carl hesitated. The older machine may need a separate safety inspection. Inspect it, Henry said. Bradley continued. And when we reach the heavier setting, no adjustment to the track. Lane. Same load progression. Henry looked toward the far end, where a grounds worker drove a steel probe into the soil. The probe sank easily through the dry crust. Same lane, Henry agreed. Carl frowned. You two are turning a demonstration into a contest. Bradley faced the crowd. A fair contest. Then he looked directly at Henry. The best machine should win. Henry placed one boot on the trailer ramp. No, he said. The best machine for the ground should win. He released the brake. The antique tractor began rolling backward down the ramp. Its iron wheels striking the steel with slow, heavy blows. Clang, clang, clang. The sound carried across the field. For the first time that morning, the $500,000 tractor was no longer the only machine everyone was watching. The safety inspection took nearly 40 minutes. Carl Mercer began at the front axle and worked backward. Testing bolts, steering play, valve fasteners, the drawbar, and every visible section of the driveline. He had judged tractor pulls for 22 years. But most of the machines he inspected had been built within the last 3 decades. Henry's tractor required a different kind of attention. There were no plastic guards to remove, no diagnostic port, no warning lights waiting to identify a fault. Every risk was exposed in iron, chain, grease, and worn steel. Carl pushed against the left rear wheel. It did not move. He crouched near the drawbar and measured its height from the ground. You changed this, he said. Henry nodded. The original hitch sat higher. Why lower it? To keep the pull from lifting too much weight off the front. Carl looked toward him. Most competitors raised their hitch as high as the rules allowed. Under the right conditions, a higher attachment point could transfer more weight toward the rear wheels and improve traction. But too much transfer could make the front end light, reduce steering control, or waste force, lifting the tractor instead of pulling the sled. You expecting the front to come up? Carl asked. I'm expecting the ground to change. Carl followed Henry's gaze toward the track. The first half of the lane was pale brown and firm. The far section looked nearly identical to anyone standing behind the fence. But Henry had walked the full distance twice before the crowd arrived. He had noticed 3 things. The first was the color. Near the finish markers, the soil carried a darker gray tone beneath the graded surface. That usually meant more moisture. The second was the smell. When Henry crushed a small clod in his hand, it released the cold mineral scent of wet clay rather than the dusty smell of dry topsoil. The third was the grounds crew's tractor. Its tire marks remained sharp near the starting line. Farther down the track, the edges had folded inward. The tires had pressed through the surface crust and displaced the softer layer beneath it. The track was not uniformly wet. That made it more dangerous. A machine could build speed and confidence on the firm section, then encounter weaker soil just as the sled became heaviest. Carl completed the inspection and stood. I'm allowing one practice start at minimum sled weight, he said. 20 feet? No more. Henry nodded. Fair. Bradley Cole had been listening from several yards away. A practice run? He asked. The rest of us didn't get one. Carl gave him a flat look. The rest of you didn't bring a 100-year-old open driveline tractor. Bradley lifted both hands and stepped back. Henry did not move toward the tractor. Instead, he walked to the starting line and pressed the heel of his boot into the track. The dry crust broke after less than an inch. He knelt and pushed 2 fingers deeper. The soil underneath was cool and smooth. When he rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, it formed a dark ribbon instead of crumbling apart. A boy behind the fence watched him. "What's he doing?" the boy asked his father. "Playing in the dirt." Henry heard the answer but kept working. He moved 3 feet to the left and tested again. The soil there was firmer. Another 3 feet. And it softened. The lane had been graded flat, but the moisture beneath it followed an old drainage pattern. Water had crossed the field in a shallow diagonal long before the fairground existed. The surface concealed it. The soil remembered it. Henry stood and studied the line of the weighted sled. The rules required each tractor to begin within the same marked lane, but the lane was wide enough to choose a path by several feet. He marked a starting position slightly right of center. Bradley approached again. "You think 6 inches of difference will save that thing?" Henry looked toward the modern tractor's wide dual tires. "No." "Then what exactly are you looking for? A place where the surface and the layer below it agree?" Bradley smiled. "That sounds poetic." "It isn't." Henry pointed toward the darker tracks near the far end. "Your tractor spreads its weight over a large area. That helps until the soil underneath begins moving as one layer." Bradley crossed his arms. "Wide tires reduce ground pressure." "They can." "They do. On soil strong enough to support them." Bradley's expression changed slightly. Henry continued. "If the top is firm and the layer below is slick, a wide tire can carry the crust forward until it breaks. Then the tread fills. After that, the engine is turning rubber against mud. The traction system will correct wheel slip. It will reduce it. That is the purpose." Henry nodded. "But reducing power after the tire loses grip does not create new ground beneath it." Bradley glanced toward the spectators nearest them. Several were listening now. "You're building an excuse before the pull begins." Henry looked at the old tractor. "No. I'm finding out what the machine will have to solve." When the sled was brought forward, Henry climbed onto the metal seat. He opened the fuel valve, checked the gear lever, and moved the throttle only slightly. Then he stepped down again and fitted the crank into the front of the engine. The crowd pressed closer to the fence. Bradley's tractor started with a button. Henry's required a sequence. He adjusted the ignition timing. He turned the engine slowly until he felt compression. Then he reset the crank so his thumb remained on the same side as his fingers, reducing the risk of injury. If the engine kicked backward, he pulled upward. The engine turned once and stopped. A few people laughed. Henry reset the crank. On the second pull, the engine fired with a deep metallic report. The exposed flywheel began rotating. The tractor shook beneath him, each combustion stroke visible through the movement of the frame. A thin cloud of smoke rose from the exhaust, then cleared as the rhythm steadied. Henry listened, not to the loudness, to the spacing. Each beat arrived evenly. The flywheel carried the engine through the pauses between them. There was no hesitation under light throttle. Carl attached the sled chain. Henry selected the lowest gear. 20 feet. Carl reminded him. Henry eased the clutch forward. The chain tightened. The first movement was almost too small to see. Then the iron wheels turned. Each lug entered the track at a steep angle, pressed through the dry crust, and left a narrow rectangular mark behind it. The tractor moved slowly enough that the crowd could hear every link in the chain take load. At 12 feet, the right wheel slipped. Only once. Henry stopped immediately. He climbed down and examined the mark. The lug had broken through the surface and smeared the clay backward. It had not reached the firmer layer he expected. He looked at the opposite wheel. Its mark was deeper and cleaner. The tractor was carrying weight unevenly. Henry walked to the rear platform and removed a small steel weight from the left side. Then he repositioned a heavier block closer to the right wheel. Carl raised an eyebrow. You found that from one slip? One wheel told me. Across the lane, the luxury tractor idled smoothly beneath the dealership banner. Its screens could measure wheel slip to a fraction. Henry had no screen. He had one rectangular scar in the dirt. He crouched beside it, touched the wet clay, and looked toward the dark section at the far end of the track. The old tractor was not ready yet. But now the ground had begun to speak. Henry spent the hour before the first official pull beneath a canvas awning beside the old tractor. To the crowd, it looked as though he was tightening bolts on a machine that had already outlived every reasonable expectation. In reality, he was changing how the tractor would meet the load. He began with the drawbar. The bar was a thick length of steel extending from beneath the rear axle. It carried old scars where chains and hooks had worn against it over decades. Henry removed the retaining pin, lowered the connection point by one hole, then measured the height again with a folding ruler. Cal Mercer watched from the inspection table. "You're giving up weight transfer," he said. "Some of it." Most pulling tractors benefited when the chain pulled slightly upward against the rear of the machine. That upward angle shifted part of the tractor's weight away from the front axle and onto the driving wheels. More weight on the rear wheels could create more traction. But the advantage had a limit. If the hitch sat too high, the chain would try to rotate the tractor backward around its rear axle. The front end could rise. Steering could disappear. Part of the engine's force would be spent lifting iron rather than moving the sled. Henry wanted the rear wheels loaded. He did not want the tractor standing on them. "The first part of the track is firm," he told Carl. "It will tempt the machine to pull harder than the far end can hold." Carl looked down the lane. "You think the front will lift when the sled box moves forward?" "I think the load will change faster than the ground does." Henry secured the pin. Next, he checked the wheel lugs. Each rear wheel carried a circle of steel bars bolted across its rim. They were crude compared with modern tread blocks. But their purpose was direct. Instead of relying on friction at the surface, the lugs entered the soil and pushed against it. Henry ran a flat file across the edge of one lug. It was not sharpened like a blade. A sharp lug could cut through soft soil without moving enough of it to produce useful resistance. Henry wanted a broad, leading face that would press against the ground. He removed dried rust from 3 lugs and tightened 2 loose bolts. A dealership mechanic stood nearby, watching. "You really think those wheels give you an advantage?" the mechanic asked. "En pavement." "No." "And on this?" Henry looked toward the practice mark where the right wheel had slipped. "They might, if they reach something that holds." The mechanic smiled. "Those things will dig holes. If they spin, every wheel spins under load. Some spin more than others." Henry climbed onto the tractor and turned the flywheel by hand until a timing mark aligned with the housing. Then he opened the magneto cover. The ignition system was purely mechanical. No computer-adjusted spark timing. No sensor-measured engine knock or load. A rotating magnet generated the electrical pulse that fired the spark plugs. Henry cleaned the contact points and checked the gap. The engine did not need to produce its maximum possible speed. It needed to fire evenly at low revolutions while the load increased. A missed ignition under light work would be an inconvenience. Under a heavy pull, it could break the rhythm of the flywheel and stall the engine. That flywheel was the part Bradley had dismissed as primitive. It was a thick iron disc mounted along the side of the engine, heavy enough that 2 men would have struggled to carry it. Once rotating, it stored energy. The engine's power strokes did not arrive continuously. Each cylinder fired, delivered force, and then passed through parts of its cycle that produced no power. The flywheel carried momentum through those gaps. It did not create energy. It smoothed it. Under a sudden increase in resistance, the wheel could release a small portion of its stored motion, giving the engine time to complete the next firing stroke instead of stopping immediately. A young farmer named Lucas Avery stepped beneath the awning. Lucas owned 300 acres north of the county road and had recently purchased a tractor with automatic transmission control. He had spent most of the morning listening to Bradley. "So that big wheel is what makes it pull?" he asked. Henry shook his head. No single part makes it pull. Then what does? Henry pointed toward the engine. That produces turning force. He moved his hand toward the transmission case. That trades speed for more turning force at the axle. Then he pointed to the rear wheels. Those have to transfer it into the soil. Finally, he nodded toward the drawbar. And that has to send the force into the load without upsetting everything in front of it. Lucas looked at the machine. So horsepower doesn't matter? It matters. Henry wiped grease from his fingers. But horsepower tells you how quickly work can be done. A pull like this may end before speed becomes useful. He pointed toward the lowest gear position. In that gear, the tractor moves slowly because the transmission reduces the axle speed. The same reduction increases torque at the wheels. Lucas frowned. Then why don't all tractors just use the lowest gear and pull anything? Because torque at the axle is not the same as traction at the ground. Henry drew a line in the soil with the heel of his boot. You can multiply force through gearing. But if the wheel cannot push against the soil, it only turns. He drew a second line, deeper than the first. A machine can have enough engine to break traction long before it reaches full power. Across the field, Bradley's tractor began a systems check. Its engine speed rose slightly. The rear tires flexed beneath the machine's weight. Digital screens illuminated inside the cab. Lucas looked from the modern tractor to Henry's exposed gears and iron wheels. That machine has automatic traction control. I know. It can reduce wheel slip. It can reduce engine power when slip begins. Isn't that the same thing? No. Henry pointed toward the field. The system can change what the tractor sends to the wheels. It cannot change what the soil is capable of holding. The distinction stayed with Lucas. A modern traction system could protect the ground from excessive spin. It could choose a better gear or reduce fuel delivery. It could balance power across multiple wheels. But it could not manufacture firmness beneath a weak surface. Henry returned to the tractor and adjusted the carburetor. The engine burned a simple fuel mixture controlled by airflow and mechanical passages, and it would smoke, foul plugs, and lose efficiency. Too lean, and it could hesitate under load. He started the engine and listened as it warmed. The exhaust struck slowly. One beat, a pause, another beat. The flywheel turned with steady authority. Henry reduced the throttle until the engine was barely above idle. Then he opened it again. Not quickly, but enough to hear whether the engine accepted the change without stumbling. It did. He placed one hand against the transmission housing and felt the vibration through the metal. There was play in the gears. There were small losses in every bearing. The tractor was not mechanically perfect. It did not need to be. It only needed each part to contribute to the same purpose. Bradley arrived near the awning as Henry shut off the fuel and allowed the engine to consume what remained in the carburetor. You've spent an hour making adjustments, Bradley said. Our machine will calculate most of that during the pull. Henry stepped down. It will calculate what it can measure. Bradley gestured toward the old tractor. And you can measure more by listening? No. Henry glanced toward the track. But I know which measurements matter before we start. Bradley's expression tightened. The loudspeaker called competitors toward the staging area. Henry placed the tractor in neutral and climbed onto the steel seat. The crowd saw an engine too small to challenge the machine across the field. Henry saw stored momentum, low gearing, controlled weight transfer, and steel lugs waiting to reach beneath the surface. The old tractor did not have more power. It had fewer places to waste, what little power it possessed. Henry chose the south service lane for his final test. It was a narrow strip of packed dirt behind the livestock barns, away from the main crowd and far enough from the loudspeaker that he could hear the tractor clearly. The lane had been used for delivery trucks earlier that week. Its surface was firmer than the competition track, but several muddy depressions remained near the fence. Henry did not need a full pull. He only needed enough resistance to see how the tractor behaved under load. Lucas Avery helped him fill an old steel wagon with broken concrete blocks from a maintenance pile. They stacked the pieces low and evenly. then added 2 short lengths of railroad rail across the floor. Carl Mercer inspected the wagon and shook his head. "This is more than a practice start. It will move." Henry said, "That is not what concerns me." Henry understood. An old tractor could fail without warning. Metal weakened from decades of stress did not always reveal itself before breaking. A cracked hitch pin, worn gear tooth, or stretched chain could turn a controlled test into an accident. Henry inspected the entire connection twice. He used a heavy chain rated well above the expected load. He checked every link for thinning or deformation. Then he attached it to the lowered drawbar and inserted a hardened pin through the clevis. Carl crouched beside the connection. "You still have the bar in the lower hole." "Yes. You may not get enough transfer on this surface. I want to see the front axle stay down." Carl looked at the concrete-filled wagon. "You may see the rear wheels spin instead. That will tell me something too." Lucas climbed onto the wagon and braced himself against the side. Henry pointed toward the ground. "Get off. I can watch the load from back here." "You can watch it from the fence." Lucas did not argue. Henry started the tractor. The engine fired on the third pull of the crank. It coughed once, sent out a dark pulse of exhaust, then settled into its slow mechanical rhythm. Henry climbed onto the seat and selected the lowest gear. He did not look toward Carl. He watched the chain. A loose chain was harmless. A tight chain stored force. He eased the clutch forward until the slack disappeared. The tractor leaned into the load. The wagon moved several inches, then stopped. Henry held the throttle steady. The flywheel slowed slightly, then recovered after the next firing stroke. The rear lugs pressed into the dirt. The left wheel found firm resistance and advanced. The right wheel did not. It slipped half a turn and carved a deep rectangular hole. The tractor twisted slightly toward the fence. Henry pressed the clutch immediately. The engine was still running, but the wagon rolled backward several inches before the chain stopped it. Carl raised one hand. "Hold it there." Henry shifted into neutral and climbed down. The right wheel had broken through the packed surface. Beneath it was a pocket of wet soil left by a leaking water line near the barn. The lugs had dug downward instead of pushing backward. Lucas pointed toward the rut. "That is just bad ground." Henry knelt beside it. "No." The ground only showed the problem. He examined both rear wheels. The left wheel had compressed the surface, but left a clean pattern. The right side had cut much deeper. The difference was too large to be explained by moisture alone. Henry looked toward the wagon. The chain did not run directly behind the tractor. It angled slightly to the right. Lucas noticed it too. The wagon is off-center. Henry walked to the rear and checked the load. One length of railroad rail had shifted during the first movement. Most of its weight now rested against the right side of the wagon. The right wagon wheel had also settled into a shallow depression, increasing resistance on that side. The uneven pull had done more than steer the tractor. It had loaded the right rear wheel differently and forced the machine to fight the wagon's sideways movement. Carl pointed toward the drawbar. "Your connection is low enough to keep the front planted. Maybe too low." Henry did not answer immediately. He walked to the front of the tractor and studied the marks left by the narrow front wheels. They had remained firmly on the ground through the entire attempt, perhaps too firmly. The tractor had not transferred enough useful weight toward the driving wheels. The rear lugs needed more pressure against the soil, but Henry's cautious hitch setting had kept too much weight on the front axle. He had solved the risk of lifting the front. In doing so, he had weakened the part of the machine responsible for traction. Henry opened the toolbox beneath the seat. He removed a wrench and loosened the drawbar bracket. Lucas watched him move the connection point upward by one hole. "I thought a higher hitch was dangerous." "It can be." "Then why change it?" "Because low is not automatically safe, and high is not automatically useful." Henry tightened the bracket. "The load, the angle, and the weight have to agree." They reset the wagon. This time, Henry secured both steel rails with chains so they could not shift. Carl used the grounds tractor to pull the wagon 6 feet left. away from the wet depression. Henry restarted the test. The chain tightened. The wagon moved farther this time. 10 feet. Then 15. The front axle became lighter, but it did not rise. More of the tractor's weight settled onto the rear wheels. The lugs entered the ground evenly and left clean. Deep marks. For several seconds, the machine appeared balanced. Then a sharp metallic crack came from behind Henry. He pressed the clutch. The engine continued turning, but the wagon stopped at once. Lucas ran forward. A small steel stabilizing plate beneath the drawbar had bent sideways. It had not broken, but one mounting hole had stretched into an oval. Carl crouched to inspect it. That plate was never designed for repeated pulls at this angle. Henry touched the warm metal. He had examined the main drawbar, the pin, and the chain. He had overlooked the smaller bracket controlling lateral movement. The strongest components had survived. The least important-looking piece had nearly ended the test. Bradley Cole had arrived in time to see the damaged bracket. He stood several yards away with one dealership mechanic. "Need us to call the Historical Society?" Bradley asked. Lucas looked angry, but Henry remained kneeling. Bradley stepped closer. "You still have time to withdraw." Henry removed the bent plate. "Why would I? Because that machine is telling you it has reached its limit." Henry studied the elongated bolt hole. "No." He held the plate up. "It is telling me where the load went." Bradley smiled. "That distinction may matter in a workshop. It will not matter when the sled stops you." Henry turned the plate in his hand. The sideways distortion showed that the chain had not pulled perfectly straight even after they moved the wagon. The old bracket had been worn before the test, and the increased hitch height had placed more stress through it. The failure was not random. It was a record. Henry carried the plate to the maintenance shed, heated it, pressed it flat, and added a thicker reinforcement on both sides. He replaced the worn bolts and checked the alignment of the entire drawbar assembly. By the time he finished, the afternoon light had begun to change. He returned to the lane but did not attempt another full pull. Instead, he moved the wagon only 5 feet. The front axle stayed controlled. Both rear wheels left equal marks. The reinforced bracket remained straight. Henry shut down the engine. Lucas looked disappointed. "That is all? That is enough. But you still do not know whether it can pull the competition sled." Henry looked toward the main field, where the luxury tractor was being polished before its exhibition run. "No one knows that yet. The first test had not proven the old tractor was ready. It had proven something more important. The machine would not forgive a poor setup simply because Henry believed in it. Every advantage had a cost. More weight transfer could improve traction but lighten the steering. A lower hitch could stabilize the front but waste the rear wheels. Iron lugs could reach firm soil, but if one side met weaker ground, they could steer the entire machine away from the load. The tractor was not a miracle from the past. It was a system, and unless every part of that system pulled in the same direction, even the smallest piece of worn steel could stop it. The first official run began shortly after noon. By then, the demonstration field had become the busiest place at the fair. The bleachers were full. People stood 3 rows deep along the fence. Even vendors from the Midway had left their booths long enough to watch the $500,000 tractor make its pull. The weighted sled sat at the starting line. From a distance, it looked simple: a long steel frame, a broad front skid, and a large weight box positioned near the rear. But beneath the frame, gears connected the sled's wheels to a chain drive. As the sled moved forward, the weight box would travel toward the front. At the beginning, most of the sled's mass rested over its wheels. Farther down the track, more of that weight would press onto the front skid. The resistance would not increase all at once. It would build with every foot. Bradley Cole climbed into the luxury tractor's cab. The door closed with a quiet seal, separating him from the noise outside. He adjusted the air-suspended seat and touched one of the screens mounted beside the steering column. A camera view of the rear hitch appeared. Another screen displayed engine load. transmission mode, tire slip, and ground speed. The tractor had already stored data from the track inspection. Bradley selected the pulling profile prepared by the dealership technician. The engine speed rose. Outside, the sound deepened but remained controlled. There was no visible shaking, no exposed flywheel, no union pulse. The machine sounded less like an engine under strain and more like a generator designed to produce force indefinitely. The crowd applauded. Henry stood near the staging area with one hand resting on his tractor's rear wheel. Lucas Avery stood beside him. "You have to admit," Lucas said, "it sounds different when that much power is under control." Henry watched the modern tractor align with the sled. "It should. You keep saying that. Because it should." Carl Mercer attached the chain and checked the connection twice. Then he raised a green flag. Bradley eased the tractor forward. The chain straightened. The first movement was almost effortless. The sled rolled from the line while the tractor's enormous rear tires barely deformed. The automatic transmission selected a low ratio, then adjusted as speed increased. The engine remained within a narrow operating range, never racing and never falling sharply. At 20 feet, the weight box began moving forward. The crowd could see it sliding along the rails. The tractor continued without hesitation. Bradley held the steering wheel lightly. Most of the work was being handled by systems the spectators could not see. Sensors compared wheel speed with actual ground speed. The transmission responded to changing load. Power was distributed across the driven axles. The machine was not merely pulling harder, it was constantly preventing small losses from becoming large ones. At 40 feet, the sled's front skid began pressing more deeply into the track. Dust rose from the dry surface. The tractor slowed slightly. A number appeared on the external display beside the track. Wheel slip remained low. Bradley looked through the side glass toward the crowd. This was the moment he had promised them. The machine encountered more resistance, measured it, and adjusted without drama. At 60 feet, the engine note changed. Not louder, heavier. The tires began biting deeper into the track. Their flexible sidewalls flattened, increasing the contact area. The tread blocks compressed the surface and released it in an even pattern. The tractor continued. Near the fence, a farmer named Ed Warren nodded. "That is what weight and rubber will do." Another farmer answered, "And four-wheel drive." Bradley heard none of it inside the cab, but he understood the reaction. The run looked clean. No smoke, no bouncing, no frantic steering corrections, no uncertainty. At 80 feet, the weight box reached the middle of the sled. The front skid now carried enough pressure to peel loose soil from the track. A ridge began building ahead of it. The tractor's speed dropped again. The dashboard indicated rising engine load. The control system changed the transmission ratio before Bradley touched anything. The engine returned to its preferred range. The tractor moved past 90 feet. The crowd grew louder. Henry lowered his eyes to the track behind the machine. He was not watching the distance marker. He was watching the tire impressions. Near the starting line, the marks were clean and wide. The tread pattern remained visible from edge to edge. Farther down, the pattern became less defined. The tires were beginning to shear the top layer of soil. Not enough to stop the tractor. Not yet. At 100 feet, the sled resisted hard enough that the tractor's front tires pressed deep into the lane. The engine delivered more power. The rear duals turned faster relative to the machine's forward motion. The slip display increased. Still acceptable. The system responded by controlling torque delivery. Bradley kept his foot steady. The tractor passed the marker Henry had studied earlier, where the dry surface concealed darker clay beneath it. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then the right rear tires sank, perhaps an inch. The movement was small enough that most spectators missed it. Henry did not. A thin line of damp soil appeared along the outer tread. The tractor continued to 118 feet before the sled finally stopped it. The tires rotated one last time. Then the control system reduced power. Bradley released the throttle. The run was over. The crowd erupted. 118 feet was an excellent distance for the opening load. It exceeded the organizer's expectation and demonstrated exactly what the dealership had advertised. Bradley stepped from the cab and raised one hand. The applause increased. Carl inspected the track and announced the result over the loudspeaker. 118 feet. 4 inches. Bradley walked toward Henry. He did not need the microphone this time. The crowd already understood what had happened. "That is the standard," he said. Henry looked toward the darker section of track. "For this load," Bradley laughed. "For any machine entered today." Carl signaled for the sled to be reset. Henry's tractor was next. The old engine started with a hard metallic report. The iron wheels moved toward the line, each lug striking the compacted surface. The applause faded into scattered conversation. Most people no longer expected a contest. They expected a demonstration of difference. Carl attached the chain. Henry selected the lowest gear and eased the clutch forward. The sled began moving. The tractor advanced slowly, no faster than a walking man. The exhaust arrived in heavy, separated beats. The flywheel turned steadily beside Henry's leg. At 20 feet, the machine remained controlled. At forte, the weight box moved forward. The front wheels became lighter, but stayed on the ground. The iron lugs entered the track and left deep rectangular impressions. At 60 feet, the engine began to slow. Henry opened the throttle slightly. The rhythm recovered. The crowd became quieter. The old machine did not look powerful, but it continued to move. At 75 feet, one rear wheel broke through the dry crust and struck damp clay. It slipped, caught again, then slipped a second time. Henry corrected the steering. At 83 feet, the sled stopped him. The flywheel slowed. One final combustion stroke pushed the tractor forward less than an inch. Then the engine stalled. Silence followed. Carl marked the distance. 83 feet, 9 inches. The crowd applauded politely. Bradley did not mock Henry. He did not need to. The modern tractor had pulled more than 34 feet farther. The result appeared decisive. Lucas approached, while Henry restarted the engine and moved away from the sled. "You were right about the ground," Lucas said quietly, but it did not matter enough. Henry climbed down and walked back along his wheel marks. The first 60 feet were clean. After that, the right side impressions became deeper. Near the stopping point, the lugs had smeared the clay but had not dug a trench. The tractor had lost traction gradually. Henry looked farther down the track, toward the place where the modern tractor had stopped. Its dual tire marks had grown darker and wider near the end. Several tread blocks were already packed with wet clay. The luxury tractor had won the first pull. Clearly, but it had also opened the surface. The sled had scraped away loose soil. The modern tires had pressed through the crust. Moist clay now lay exposed along the heaviest section of the lane. Carl announced that the next round would use an increased sled setting. Ground workers began adding weight. Bradley stood near the display screen, receiving congratulations. Henry remained on the track. He pressed his fingers into one of the modern tractor's final tire marks. The clay beneath it was smooth, wet, and slick enough to shine. The first run had favored power, speed, and controlled traction. The second would begin on damaged ground with a heavier sled. Henry looked toward his iron wheels. The contest had not ended. It had finally reached the part of the field his tractor had been built to understand. The second round began with the track already changed. The first pull had removed the loose top layer. The sled's front skid had scraped a shallow groove down the lane, while the modern tractor's dual tires had pressed moisture upward from beneath the crust. What had looked like firm ground an hour earlier was now streaked with dark clay. Ground workers added steel plates to the sled and moved the weight box farther forward on its rails. The machine would become difficult sooner this time. There would be less distance before the front skid began digging into the track. Carl Mercer inspected the lane, then looked toward the organizers. "We can regrade it," one of them suggested. Bradley answered before Carl could. No. He stood beside the luxury tractor, still confident from the first-round victory. Same lane was the agreement. Henry said nothing. He was crouched near the 80-foot marker, studying the damage. The modern tractor's old tire marks were easy to identify. They formed two broad channels on each side of the lane, with damp clay squeezed into low ridges at their edges. In several places, the tread pattern had disappeared completely. That concerned Henry more than deep ruts would have. A deep rut could provide side support. A polished surface offered almost none. He pressed his thumb into the clay and pulled it across the mark. The soil smeared like grease. Lucas Avery stood behind him. Could they stop the event because of this? They could. Should they? Henry looked toward the sled. Not yet. The modern tractor moved into position. Bradley climbed into the cab and closed the door. On the exterior display, the pulling profile appeared again. This time, the system showed a higher expected load and reduced target speed. The tractor backed toward the sled with precise, measured movements. Carl connected the chain. The green flag rose. Bradley eased forward. For the first 30 feet, the machine looked as dominant as before. The large tires compressed the lane without visible struggle. The engine stayed within its controlled operating range. The transmission adjusted smoothly as the load increased. Then the sled's weight box began moving. At 40 feet, the front skid pushed into the exposed clay. The tractor slowed. Its tires started carrying small rolls of wet soil upward before releasing them behind the axle. The tread was still cleaning itself, but not completely. At 50 feet, the external display showed increasing slip. A murmur moved through the crowd. Bradley reduced speed and allowed the system to choose a lower ratio. The engine note deepened. More torque reached the wheels. The tractor advanced another 10 feet. The right side tires entered one of the broad channels created during the first round. The surface beneath them shifted. The cab tilted slightly. Bradley corrected the steering. The machine continued. But the difference between wheel speed and ground speed widened. The tires were still turning in a disciplined, controlled manner. Yet the tractor's forward progress had become noticeably slower. The traction system responded. Engine output was moderated to prevent uncontrolled spin. Power was redistributed across the driven wheels. The transmission held the engine near the range where it could work most efficiently. Every adjustment was logical. None of them made the soil firmer. At 70 feet, the rear tread blocks filled with clay. The tires no longer entered the ground as distinct edges. They pressed against it as rounded, mud-coated surfaces. The tractor moved another 3 feet. Then 2. Bradley increased the throttle. The engine answered instantly. The tires turned faster. The machine barely advanced. A wet grinding sound replaced the clean rhythm of the earlier pull. Clay rolled beneath the tires and collected in front of the contact patches. The tractor was not pushing against stationary soil anymore. It was pushing against a layer that moved with it. Henry watched the rear axle. The machine had enough power to keep every wheel turning. That was now part of the problem. The tires sheared the weakened surface faster than the tractor could climb over it. Each rotation polished the clay more thoroughly. The display showed rising wheel slip. The control system reduced torque. The engine sound softened. Forward movement nearly stopped. Bradley disabled one automatic setting and took more direct control. The tractor surged. Mud flew from the rear tires. The crowd reacted with renewed excitement. But Henry saw the machine sink another inch. Bradley tried again. The engine roared harder than at any point in the first round. The tires rotated rapidly, throwing wet clay against the fenders and the sides of the sled. The tractor moved less than a foot. Carl lowered the red flag. Stop. Inside the cab, Bradley hesitated. The wheels turned once more. The machine did not advance. Carl stepped into the lane and waved the flag directly in front of the windshield. Bradley released the throttle. The tires stopped. For several seconds, the entire field was silent except for the idling engine. The distance appeared on the board. 74 feet. 2 inches. The modern tractor had failed more than 40 feet earlier than in the first round. Bradley climbed down. His clean boots sank immediately into the churned clay. He looked toward the rear tires, then toward the sled. Mud had packed between the tread blocks until much of the rubber surface looked almost smooth. A dealership mechanic approached. The lower layer gave way. He said quietly. Bradley pulled off one glove. The system should have caught the slip sooner. It did. Then why did it keep digging? The mechanic looked at the track. Because there was no stable layer left within the tread depth. Bradley turned toward the display. The numbers showed available power. We had power. That is not what I asked. The mechanic paused. We did not have enough grip to use it. Near the fence, the crowd had begun discussing the result. Some blamed the wet lane. Others blamed Bradley for increasing throttle. Several insisted the track should be regraded before Henry's attempt. Bradley heard them. This round is invalid, he told Carl. The surface deteriorated during the pull. Carl looked at the lane. The surface deteriorated because of the pull. That is exactly the problem. It is part of the track. Bradley pointed toward Henry's tractor. You cannot send iron wheels through that after our machine broke the surface. They will reach underneath the mud. Henry stood. That is what wheels are supposed to do. Bradley turned sharply. You knew this would happen. I knew it could. You watched us destroy the lane? I watched your tires lose the layer they depended on. Bradley stepped closer. That machine did not beat mine. The ground stopped mine. Henry looked down at the mud packed around Bradley's boots. The ground is what a tractor pulls against. Carl walked toward the sled and examined its front skid. The additional weight had forced it several inches deeper into the lane. A heavy ridge of wet soil had collected ahead of it. We continue, he announced. Bradley stared at him. Without grading? Same lane. Samma sledsättning. That was the agreement. The old tractor was brought forward. Its narrow iron wheels rolled into the ruts left by the luxury machine. Instead of floating on the polished clay, the steel lugs cut through it and struck deeper with every turn. The crowd moved closer to the fence. Henry climbed onto the metal seat. Before starting the engine, he looked down the lane. The track was worse than he had expected. The right side was deeply churned. The center line had been scraped into a shallow channel. Near Bradley's stopping point, the clay had become a thick paste. The iron wheels might reach firmer soil beneath it, or they might dig until the rear axle settled into the mud. Henry could no longer adjust the track. He could only decide how to enter it. He shifted the tractor several inches left, placing one rear wheel near the edge of the damaged channel and the other inside it. The position looked uneven, but it gave the left lugs a chance to find ground. The modern tires had not fully polished. Carl attached the chain. Bradley stood beside the track, mud drying on his trousers. The luxury tractor had not run out of strength. It had run out of something strength could push against. Now the machine everyone had laughed at would have to prove that its crude iron wheels could find what $500,000 of controlled power had lost. Carl Mercer stood beside the old tractor and looked down the damaged lane. The track was no longer smooth. The luxury tractor had left two broad channels filled with wet clay, and the weighted sled had pushed a ridge of mud ahead of its front skid. Carl lowered his voice. You can still withdraw. Henry looked toward the 74-foot marker where Bradley's tractor had stopped. No. That ground could pull your wheels sideways. I know. And if those lugs dig too deep, you may not get the tractor out without another machine. Henry placed one hand on the steering wheel. Then we stop before that happens. Bradley approached from the other side of the lane. His confidence had returned. Though mud still covered the lower half of his trousers. This proves nothing, he said. The track failed. Henry glanced at the modern tractor. The track was part of the test. Bradley pointed toward the old machine. If that thing moves farther, it will only be because your steel wheels can cut through the surface. Our tires opened. That is possible. Bradley had expected an argument. Henry's calm answer irritated him more. So you admit the conditions favor you now. They favor whichever machine can use them. Several people near the fence heard the exchange. The crowd became quiet again. Bradley turned toward Carl. "Add another plate to the sled." Carl frowned. That was not part of the agreement. Bradley looked at Henry. If he believes the old tractor is built for this ground, let him prove it under a heavier load. Lucas stepped forward. "You already had your pull." Henry raised a hand, stopping him. Then he looked toward the sled. One more plate would increase the pressure on the front skid. It would make the first half of the lane harder and the damaged final section far more dangerous. But it would also reduce speed. That mattered. The modern tractor had entered the soft clay with momentum. When traction failed, its power had turned quickly into wheel spin. Henry's tractor would never build that speed. It would meet the resistance slowly, one wheel lug at a time. Henry faced Carl. "Add it." The crowd reacted immediately. Carl stared at him. "You are sure? Same lane. Same starting point. One extra plate." Bradley smiled. Now, he believed, the antique would not reach 50 feet. The grounds crew carried another steel plate onto the sled. The added weight landed with a heavy clang. Henry walked the lane once more. He did not inspect every inch. He already knew where the worst ground waited. Instead, he chose his path. He placed the left rear wheel near the firmer edge of the lane. The right wheel would remain inside the damaged channel. It was an uneven line, but it allowed at least one wheel to search for stronger soil. At the starting point, Henry used a piece of white chalk to mark one iron lug. Lucas watched him. "What is that for?" "To see how much the wheel turns compared with how far we move." The old tractor had no digital slip monitor. The chalk mark would give Henry a simple answer. If the wheel completed several rotations while the machine barely advanced, he would know the lugs were cutting soil rather than pushing against it. Carl connected the chain. Henry climbed onto the steel seat and started the engine. The flywheel began turning. Slowly, evenly. Bradley stood near the luxury tractor with his arms crossed. Henry selected the lowest gear. Before engaging the clutch, he looked once toward the far end of the track. His grandfather had never taught him that old machines were superior. He had taught him that every machine had a job it understood. The green flag rose. Henry eased the clutch forward. The chain tightened. For a moment, neither the tractor nor the sled moved. Then the first iron lug pressed through the mud. The old machine moved ahead by less than an inch. The crowd fell silent. Henry did not increase the throttle. He allowed the flywheel to carry the engine into its next stroke. Another lug entered the ground. Then another. The tractor began to pull. The first 10 feet took longer than Bradley's tractor had needed to cover 30. Henry did not care. Speed was not the goal. The old engine fired in slow, heavy beats while the flywheel carried each stroke into the next. The front wheels trembled against the rutted track, but they stayed down. At 20 feet, the sled began resisting harder. The left iron wheel found firmer soil near the edge of the lane. The right wheel slipped once inside the muddy channel, then caught again. Henry watched the chalk mark. The wheel was turning, but not uselessly. The tractor was still gaining ground. At 40 feet, the engine note dropped. Henry opened the throttle slightly. The machine responded without surging. Behind him, the weight box moved forward on the sled. The front skid dug deeper and pushed wet soil into a growing ridge. The crowd had stopped laughing. They could hear every part of the struggle. Steel lugs entered the clay. The chain tightened. The flywheel slowed, recovered, and slowed again. At 55 feet, the right wheel sank deeper than Henry expected. The tractor leaned. For 1 second, it looked as though the old machine would turn sideways into the rut. Henry corrected gently. A sharp steering movement would have broken the left wheel's grip. Instead, he allowed the tractor to follow the edge of the channel until both rear wheels were pulling in the same direction again. The machine continued. 60 feet, then 65. Bradley stepped closer to the fence. His expression had changed. The old tractor was approaching the point where the luxury machine had begun losing control. At 70 feet, the mud thickened around the iron wheels. The right lugs disappeared almost completely before rising coated in clay. The left lugs still struck firmer ground. The engine slowed further. Lucas whispered, "Come on." Henry heard nothing except the rhythm beneath him. One firing stroke, one turn of the flywheel, one more bite from the steel wheel. The tractor reached 74 feet. The exact point where Bradley had stopped,